Hello and welcome. My name is Biagio Mazza, Pastoral Associate, St. Sabina Parish in Belton, Missouri, and I'm here to welcome you to another Do You Know series question. As we continue our series on the beginnings of Christianity, today's Do You Know question is, do you know how the destruction of the Jewish temple impacted Jesus' followers? As the conflict intensified among Jews with regards to Jesus as the long-awaited Messiah and the acceptance of Gentiles into the Jewish community as disciples of Jesus, significant events occurred within the history of Judaism and at the time of the first century that really impacted how this conflict was going to be resolved or where it would lead. It's important to remember that in the year 66 to 70, there was a major revolt by the Jews against the Romans, who were the occupiers of the land of Israel. There had always been revolts against the Romans to attempt to get them out of the land of Israel, but this was a very significant one, and the Romans reacted as they typically did with overwhelming force. They came down, and by the year 70, they besieged Jerusalem and eventually captured it and burned and destroyed the temple. The burning and destruction of the temple, as well as the destruction of the city, led to a major crisis within Judaism. The crisis was, how can we be Jewish within the context of no temple? Since two-thirds of Torah regulations had to do with Jewish ritual and practice and sacrifice and so on, how can we be truly Jewish and be faithful to the Torah without a temple? And so Judaism really was in an identity crisis and needed some direction. And the group that surfaced to help give it direction and eventually would begin to dominate Judaism was a group that had been in existence before, but now took the leadership in determining the future of Judaism, and that group was the Pharisees. So Judaism began to take on the tone and leadership of the Pharisees, which led them to say, we can continue to be Jewish without the temple, by making sure that Jewish Torah and regulation was focused on the family and at the home with some sort of connection to the synagogues. And so as a result, Pharisees began to take leadership, began to form the calendar of feasts and regulations and so on, and they began to move along in challenging Judaism to continue to be faithful to the Torah in this new context. In its fidelity to the Torah, the Pharisees reacted to a group of Jews who had been followers of Jesus, who had accepted Jesus as the long-awaited Jewish Messiah. And they felt that in order to give strength to the direction that they were given to Judaism, they had to really put down this movement of Jesus followers by essentially saying that because they were not being faithful to the Torah and Moses' regulations, they were really not being faithful to Judaism, and therefore they could not be called true Jews. Well, this set up a real conflict between Jews who had accepted Jesus and Jews who didn't, especially with the Jewish leadership now dominated by the Pharisees. And the things got even more complicated as the followers of Jesus began to welcome and accept Gentiles into their group. And so eventually what led to was kind of a persecution or a rejection, if you want, by mainstream Judaism of any Jew who had accepted Jesus as Messiah. And so as a result, we start to have a great deal of conflicts, people being thrown out of synagogues, not being accepted, and so on. And so it created a major identity crisis within Jews who had accepted Jesus as Messiah to say, are we still Jews? Can we still relate to our fellow Jews? Can we still pray together and so on? The Gospels of Matthew and John, written around this time, roughly about 85 to 90 AD, reflect this great deal of tension and conflicts between Jews who had accepted Jesus and Jews who didn't. And it came to a point where it was very obvious that Jews who had accepted Jesus as Messiah in fidelity to him and in welcoming Gentiles really felt that they could no longer be at home within the Judaism of the Pharisees. And so what starts to happen is a kind of movement away, the beginning of a movement that will lead the Jesus followers to a whole other direction, and Judaism goes in another direction as well. And so what you begin to have is the split that will occur between within Judaism, the first split within Christianity exactly, within Judaism between those who accepted Jesus as Messiah and those who didn't, as well as the Jews that accepted Gentiles into their movement as Jesus followers. This will eventually lead to a splitting at various times within the empire, within certainly the first 3 centuries, a splitting between Jews and eventually Jews who accepted Jesus as Messiah, who came to be eventually referred to as Christians. And so we end up having, by the end of the 1st century, there be very strong beginnings of 2 separate tracks. One, Judaism that will continue on its own track, and another one, Jews who had accepted Jesus and Gentiles now moving on their own track. And this group will eventually be referred to as Christians, and eventually will set up a period of antipathy and violence that will result as a result of the opposition towards one another, reflected most of the time in the Gospels. So I hope this has helped to explain just a bit of how a historical development within Judaism actually led to a split between Jews who accepted Jesus and Jews who rejected Jesus. And I hope you'll return again to more Do You Know series questions to explore further the beginnings of Christianity. Thank you very much.